Who's hiding back there? Richard Whitmore's voice cut sharply through the dark stable. Who's there? He barked, stepping farther inside. Who's in my barn? He stood in the doorway, his robe hanging loosely off one shoulder, silver hair flattened to one side from sleep. One hand rubbed at his eyes while the other held a flashlight. The horses had awakened him first. They were restless in their stalls, shifting nervously, snorting, and striking their hooves against the wooden floor. A faint noise came from behind the stacked bales of hay. Richard raised the flashlight. I'm not asking again. Come out where I can see you. The beam swept across the floor, past the feed bins, past Grace's stall, and stopped on a figure curled up in the corner. Annie jolted awake so suddenly that her shoulder hit the wall behind her. The light struck her face directly, blinding and abrupt. She raised a hand to shield her eyes. It's me, she stammered. It's just me. Sir, I'm sorry. Richard froze. At first, he had thought it was a man, maybe a drifter. Maybe someone trying to steal tack, tools, or anything that could be sold before sunrise. But the person crouched in front of him was a young black woman wearing a thin coat, clutching an old bag of clothes against her chest, trembling so badly she could barely keep still. A girl? He muttered. Good Lord. I thought. He stopped himself and lowered the flashlight slightly. Annie was still squinting, covering her face with her hand. Noticing that, Richard lowered the beam to the straw-covered floor. All right, he said, still cautious. Is that better? She nodded without moving. What are you doing in my barn? I didn't steal anything, she said quickly. I swear. I never touched your horses. I just needed a place to sleep. To sleep? Just for one night. I was cold. I was tired. I didn't know this was your property. I'll leave in the morning. Richard stared at her. Behind him, Grace shifted in her stall and let out a soft breath. Calmer. Now that the shouting had stopped. You trespassed on private property. I know. You do realize I could call the sheriff. At that, Annie's expression changed. Fear flashed across her face. She pulled the bag closer, as if it were the last thing in the world that still belonged to her. Please don't, she whispered. Please, I can leave right now if you want. I'll go. Just don't call the police. Richard rubbed both eyes with his thumb and forefinger, still not fully awake. Then he let out a tired breath and stretched as if the cold had settled deep into his bones. Let me understand this, he said. You're a young woman, alone in the middle of the night, and instead of sleeping at home, you sneaked into my barn and slept behind a pile of hay. Annie lowered her head. Do you hear how that sounds? Yes, sir. So where is your home? She hesitated, then reached for the bag beside her. It crinkled as she pulled it closer. One sleeve of an old sweater stuck out from the tied opening. Under her other arm was a worn duffel bag with nearly torn handles. This is everything I have, she said quietly. I was forced to leave tonight. Who forced you out? The building manager, Mr. Calloway. He said the building had new owners, and they wanted everyone out. Richard narrowed his eyes. Everyone? Everyone who owed rent, she said softly. Me too. My grandmother is in the hospital, so I fell behind. I was trying to get there, but it was late, and I was exhausted. I thought if I could sleep somewhere out of the wind for a few hours, I could leave before anyone saw me. Richard didn't answer right away. Annie swallowed. I know it was wrong. I know this isn't mine, but I never meant to steal from you. He let out a short breath with no humor in it. You know how many people have told me that over the years? They show up at the gates, the barns, the office, the parking lot. Everyone has a story. Everyone just needs one night, one chance, a little help. Then morning comes, and something's missing. I'm not like that. Don't you think every person who stole from me said the same thing? Annie's face tightened not with anger, but with the pain of being compared to people she had never met. No, sir, she said quietly. I guess they probably did. She looked at him for a moment, then lowered her eyes to the straw beneath her feet. But I'm still asking you, she said. Please let me stay here. Not in your house, not near your things, just here in the barn until morning. Richard pressed his lips together. You want to sleep in a barn? I've done it before. That doesn't make it safe. The streets aren't safe either. The answer slipped out before Annie could stop herself. She pulled the bag closer and tried to stand, perhaps to prove she would leave if he ordered her to, but her knees buckled. She grabbed the hay to steady herself. trying to breathe through the pain in her legs. Richard saw it. She wasn't pretending. Her body had reached the limit of what pride could carry. My legs hurt so much they're almost numb, she admitted quietly. I walked from Riverside Court. I was trying to get to St. Luke's Hospital, where my grandmother is staying. I thought I could make it, but I couldn't. I had nowhere else to go tonight. You don't have any family? My grandmother is my family. No church? No friends? Annie shook her head slightly. Not at this hour. And I don't want to burden people who already have enough troubles of their own. Richard looked at her for a long moment. The suspicion was still there, stubborn and practical. Sir, Annie said, her voice weakening. I know you don't believe me. I wouldn't believe me either if I saw someone standing here like this. But I'm tired. I can't keep walking. If you make me leave, I will. I just don't know how far I'll get. Richard glanced toward the open barn door. The darkness outside seemed harsher now, the cold slipping through the gaps in the boards and spreading across the straw. He lifted the flashlight slightly, this time not toward her face, but toward the side aisle where a warmer light glowed above the tack room. Pick up your things, he said. Annie startled. You want me to leave? I said pick them up. Bring that bag over here where there's some light. If we're going to talk, I can't have you hiding behind hay bales like a frightened rabbit. She stared at him, uncertain. Come on, he added, his voice softer this time. Take it slow. Annie nodded and bent down to pick up her bags. Her fingers were stiff from the cold, and the plastic bag slipped once before she caught it again. She dragged it behind her with one hand and carried the worn duffel bag with the other. Every step was careful, as if her legs were arguing with the rest of her body. Richard stepped aside to make room for her, watching quietly without pressuring her. Richard led her into the wide aisle between the horse stalls, where a row of overhead bulbs cast just enough light for him to see her without shining the flashlight directly into her face. Annie stood beneath the lights, both hands clutching the bag against her chest, her shoulders hunched against the cold. Richard set her duffel bag on a wooden bench, then stepped back, deliberately keeping a safe distance. Stay right there, he said. Not because I'm trying to scare you. I just need to know what I'm dealing with. Annie nodded. Yes, sir. And stop calling me sir every other breath. My name is Richard. She looked at him uncertain. Mr. Richard? Richard almost corrected her, then let it go. Fine. Mr. Richard then. Now, tell me everything from the beginning. The truth. No dressing it up. Annie glanced quickly toward the barn door, as if measuring how fast she could get out if his voice changed. My grandmother is at St. Luke's Hospital, room 214. She got sick in the kitchen a few days ago. They took her by ambulance. I stay with her most of the day and go home at night. Where is home? Riverside Court, Building C. Richard's eyes shifted slightly, but his face did not change. Go on. We owe rent. I know that. I've been trying to pay it down. I told Mr. Calloway I could pay part of it on Friday. But tonight, he said the building had a new owner, and anyone behind on rent had to leave right away. At night? Yes. Richard rubbed his chin. The anger he had brought into the barn began to turn into something heavier, something harder to name. Did he give you any papers? He had a clipboard. That's not what I asked. I don't know. Maybe. He said everything had already been handled. He gave me 1 hour to pack. Richard looked at the duffel bag, then at the bag she was holding. And this is all you took? A few clothes, my grandmother's medication list, her Bible. The family pictures are with Mrs. Helen. Your neighbor? Yes. So instead of calling someone, you started walking through the night? I don't have anyone to call. What about a shelter? Annie lowered her head. 2 winters ago, when the building lost power, I tried taking my grandmother to one. The public restroom was packed. There was a man outside who kept following us. My grandmother said she would rather go home and lock the door in the cold than stay somewhere warm where nobody cared if someone hurt us. Richard said nothing. He had heard people talk about poverty in meetings, when they needed tax breaks or community grants. But he had rarely heard it spoken so plainly. Annie shifted her weight and winced. Richard noticed at once. Your feet? They're fine. They don't look fine. I can still walk if I have to. That wasn't an answer. She swallowed. They hurt. Richard turned into the tack room, opened a cabinet, and took out a clean wool horse blanket. When he came back with it, Annie immediately stiffened. Relax, he said. It's clean. I don't want to disturb your things. It's just a blanket. He handed it to her. Annie hesitated before taking it. Put it around your shoulders. She obeyed. The blanket was thick and heavy, smelling faintly of hay and soap. As her fingers closed around the edge, the trembling in her body finally began to slow. Richard pulled a folding chair from against the wall and set it across from the bench. Sit down. I'm fine. You nearly fell over in my barn. I don't want to get anything dirty. Sit down. Annie sat. Richard remained standing, his arms crossed over his chest. Do you have identification? Yes. She carefully reached into her coat pocket, pulled out an old state ID, and held it out to him with 2 fingers. Richard took it and read the name. Annie Williams. Yes. He checked the address. Riverside Court, Building C. Then he handed it back. At least that part matches. I told you the truth. People can tell the truth one piece at a time. Annie nodded. I know. That answer unsettled him more than it should have. She did not argue. She did not try to win. She did not act offended. She simply accepted it, as if she was used to not being believed. Richard nodded slowly. Here's what's going to happen, he said. You are not sleeping behind the hay bales. Annie's head snapped up. Mr. Richard, I won't cause any trouble. I can stay right where you found me. No, you'll sleep in the tack room. It has a heater, a lock on the inside, and nobody is going to step on you in the dark. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. You're letting me stay? For tonight only. She nodded again and again. Thank you. I'll leave early. I didn't say we were finished. Annie froze. Tomorrow morning. I'm calling Street Luke's hospital to confirm your grandmother is there. I'm also calling this man Calloway. Her face changed at once. Please don't get Mrs. Helen in trouble. I'm not calling your neighbor. If Mr. Calloway finds out I caused trouble, he could put her out too. That made Richard look at her more closely. You're standing in a barn with nowhere to go. And you're worried about your neighbor? She helped me. I don't want her punished for that. Richard turned his face away. The phone in the pocket of his robe buzzed. He pulled it out, saw Eleanor's name on the screen, and declined the call. Annie noticed, then quickly lowered her eyes. My wife, he said, though he did not know why he felt the need to explain. She won't be happy that I'm here. She gets unhappy over smaller things than that. The words slipped out before Richard could stop them. He put the phone back in his pocket. Then he opened the tack room door. Inside, saddles rested neatly on racks. Bridles hung from hooks. A metal cabinet stood against the wall, and a small heater hummed near the floor. Richard moved a few folded pads aside and pointed to a padded bench along the wall. It's not a bedroom, but it's warmer than the aisle. That's more than I expected. That may be the saddest thing I've heard tonight. Annie stepped inside slowly, still holding her bag close. Keep your things with you, Richard said. Lock the door from the inside if it makes you feel safer. There's a bathroom through that door. Don't go into the house. Don't open any outside doors. If you need something, knock hard on the wall. I'll hear it through the monitor. The monitor? The barn has cameras and an audio alarm. Annie's eyes widened. So you can see me? In the aisle, yes. Not inside this room. I'm suspicious. Not indecent. She nodded, embarrassed. I'm sorry. Stop apologizing for asking questions. Only then did Annie look up at him, really look at him, as if trying to decide whether those words were permission or another test. Richard pointed toward a shelf. There are clean towels there. I'll bring down some water and something from the kitchen. Probably soup. You don't have to do that. I know. He turned to leave, then stopped in the doorway. Annie. Yes? If your story is true, then you shouldn't have been put out on the street tonight. Her eyes dropped to the floor. But I was. Richard had no answer for that. He stepped back into the aisle and left the door partly open, wide enough that she would not feel trapped inside. As he walked toward the house, Grace gave a soft whinny from her stall. Richard stopped and looked back. Through the narrow gap, he could see Annie sitting on the bench, the wool blanket wrapped around her shoulders, her bag at her feet. She had not lain down yet. She sat with her back straight, as if even sleep required someone's permission. If Annie's story touched your heart, please like this video and leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Your support helps this channel share more stories about kindness, justice, and the people who are too often forgotten. And if you believe every voice deserves to be heard, please subscribe to the channel. Richard stood there longer than he had intended. Then the phone in his pocket began to vibrate. He stepped deeper into the aisle between the horse stalls and lowered his voice as he answered. Daniel, this had better be important. He listened in silence. You mean Riverside Court has already been sold? Daniel's voice continued through the phone. The last traces of sleepiness on Richard's face slowly disappeared. No, he said after a pause. That property was not supposed to be transferred without my approval. Another silence followed. What account did she use? Richard's eyes unconsciously shifted toward the door of the tack room. You're telling me Eleanor sold the entire apartment complex to cover her gambling debts? The air in the stable seemed to grow colder. Daniel kept talking. Richard stood still and listened without interrupting. Fine, he said at last. Send me everything. He ended the call. For a few seconds, Richard did not move. Riverside Court. The name repeated itself again and again in his mind. The girl sitting just a few steps away from him. The eviction notice. The grandmother in the hospital. The property manager throwing tenants out of their homes at night. Richard looked back toward the tack room. The door was open wider than before. Annie was no longer sitting on the chair. She had spread the wool blanket on the floor instead of lying on the cushioned couch. The garbage bag rested beside her head like a pillow. One of her arms was still wrapped tightly around it. Even in her sleep, Richard frowned. He walked quietly to the doorway. Annie. There was no response. He called again. Annie. Her eyes opened at once, and she sat up as if she had been jolted awake from a nightmare. I'm sorry, she said immediately. I didn't mean to fall asleep. I can move if you need this room. Richard looked down at the floor. Why are you lying down there? She glanced toward the couch behind her. That couch looks expensive. It's just a couch. I didn't want to get it dirty. He exhaled slowly. You think the floor is better? I've slept in places much worse than this. That answer bothered him more than he expected. The heater still hummed softly beside them. The room was warm enough for the night. But in the end, it was still just a storage room. Saddles hung from their hooks. Leather straps dangled down, casting long shadows on the wall, and the girl had curled herself up so small, as if she were trying to squeeze into the empty space between things that were never meant for a human being. Richard was the first to look away. Get your things. Annie blinked. What? Your bag. She slowly stood up. Did I do something wrong? No. Then, you're not sleeping in a storage room. Her fingers tightened around the blanket. Mr. Richard, this is already more than enough. No, it isn't. She looked at him, confused. Richard rubbed his forehead. He was tired. He was irritated. He was angry at Eleanor. Angry about the phone call. And angry at himself for caring about all of this as much as he did. I have several guest rooms upstairs, he said. Tonight, you'll sleep in one of them. Annie stared at him. No, she said very softly. Richard looked up. No? I can stay here. You just told me you've slept in places worse than this. Yes. That is not the argument you think it is. I don't want to go inside your house. Why not? Because then I'll owe you even more. The room suddenly went quiet. In that moment, Richard looked at her differently. Not because of what she had said, but because he knew she truly believed it. Most people wanted more. More help, more time, more chances. This girl was trying to reduce a debt she thought she already carried. You don't owe me anything, he said. Annie lowered her head. Life doesn't work that way. Richard let out a dry laugh, though there was no humor in it. Maybe not your life. She still stood there, hesitating. Are you planning to argue with me all night? He asked. No, sir. Good. Then bring your things inside. She looked down at her bag. All of it? Yes. He stepped aside. Annie bent down to pick up the bag, but the moment she straightened, she staggered under its weight. Richard caught it before it could fall to the floor. She froze. Easy, he said. I'm fine. I know. People who aren't fine always say that. He picked up the duffel bag and walked ahead. The path from the stable to the house cut across the backyard. The cold air hit them immediately. Annie pulled the blanket tighter around herself and followed quietly behind him. The house gradually appeared beneath the outdoor lights. Annie slowed down. It looked more like a photograph in a magazine than a real home. Stone walls, tall windows, a wide porch stretching along the front. Warm yellow light glowing behind the glass. She stopped completely. Richard noticed at once. Now what? I can't go in there. You absolutely can. I don't belong in places like that. He looked at her for a second. When I was 22, I used to think the same thing. Then he opened the back door. A wave of warmth spilled out. The kitchen lights were still on. Copper pans hung above the island. A pot was cooling on the stove. The air carried the faint smell of coffee and beef stew. Annie stood close to the doorway, afraid to step farther inside. Richard set the bag down. If it makes you feel better, take off your shoes. She immediately looked down at her feet. I wasn't going to. You were. She silently removed her shoes and lined them neatly against the wall. Richard opened a cabinet, took down a bowl, then lifted the lid from the pot on the stove. Have you eaten? Annie hesitated. That bad? I had a little cake earlier. What time? She thought for a moment. Maybe around 10. Richard ladled some stew into the bowl. Then eat. I'm not hungry. He turned his head and looked at her. Annie immediately corrected herself. I mean, not very hungry. Sit down. She sat on the edge of the chair, as if she might jump up at any moment. Richard placed the bowl in front of her. Steam rose between them. Annie stared at the spoon but did not touch it. Are you waiting for permission again? He asked. Her eyes lifted to his. Richard leaned against the counter. Eat. She slowly picked up the spoon. The first bite made her pause. Richard pretended not to notice. The second bite came faster. By the third, she was no longer trying to eat politely. Richard turned his face toward the window. Somewhere behind the house, Grace lightly tapped her hoof inside her stall. His phone vibrated again. Eleanor. He ignored it. Across from him, Annie had eaten half the bowl. At last, she slowed down, suddenly aware of herself. I'm sorry. For what this time? I ate too fast. Richard shook his head. You apologize more than anyone I've ever met. Her hand paused. My grandmother said people like us have to. Richard did not answer, because in that moment, for the first time, he was not sure what people like us meant. Or maybe it simply meant people who understood too well that the world sometimes charged interest even on kindness. He picked up the duffel bag and nodded toward the hallway. Come on. Where? I'm taking you to the guest room before you find another corner of the floor to sleep on. Annie slowly stood. She was still clutching the garbage bag. Richard noticed. You can put that down. No, sir. It's just clothes. No, she said quietly. It's my home. Richard looked at her. Then, without another word, he turned and headed toward the staircase. Upstairs, his phone began ringing again. This time, he did not need to look to know it was Eleanor. Richard led the way upstairs without speaking. Annie followed several steps behind, holding the old clothing bag against her chest with both hands. The house felt too quiet, not empty, just lived in by someone who had space enough to keep his thoughts far apart. Family photos lined one wall of the staircase. Horses, award ceremonies, business events. One picture showed Richard younger, standing beside a woman with blonde hair. Annie looked away, before he noticed. At the end of the hall, Richard stopped in front of a guest room and pushed the door open. You can stay here. Annie stood at the doorway. The room was bigger than the apartment kitchen she had left behind. White curtains, a quilt folded at the foot of the bed, a reading lamp beside an armchair near the window. She did not move. Richard looked back. Problem? I've never slept in a room this nice. It's a guest room. It looks like a hotel. He almost smiled but didn't. There are towels in the bathroom. Clean clothes probably won't fit, so don't worry about that tonight. Annie nodded. Richard set her duffel near the chair. The clothing bag stayed in her hands. You planning to carry that into the shower too? Her fingers tightened around it. Richard sighed quietly. Fine, keep it. Annie lowered her eyes. Sorry. There it is again. What? That word. She looked confused. Sorry, he repeated. You say it every 5 minutes. Annie looked down at the floorboards. Grandma says apologizing early keeps people from getting angry. Richard leaned against the doorframe. And does it work? She thought for a moment. Not always. His phone vibrated again. Eleanor. He declined it. Annie noticed this time but said nothing. You need anything? He asked. No. Blanket? No. Water? I'm okay. You already used that line tonight. Annie looked embarrassed. Richard pointed toward the bed. Sleep. We'll deal with tomorrow. He turned to leave. Mr. Richard? He stopped. Thank you. He nodded once and closed the door behind him. Downstairs, the kitchen still smelled faintly of stew. Richard stood by the island with both hands resting against the counter. Riverside Court. The name would not leave his head. He picked up the phone and called Daniel back. His attorney answered immediately. "You still awake?" "Apparently not by choice," Richard said. "Tell me everything." "Eleanor sold Riverside Court 6 weeks ago through a holding company." Richard straightened. "What holding company?" "Whitmore Community Housing." His jaw tightened. "That account was never hers." "I know." Richard walked toward the window overlooking the stable. Daniel continued. "The buyer plans luxury redevelopment. Existing tenants are being removed." "Removed how?" "Non-payment notices. Fast-track evictions." "At night?" Silence. Richard understood before Daniel answered. "Some complaints came in," Daniel admitted. "Nothing official yet." Richard looked toward the stable. Annie had walked all the way here carrying her life in 2 bags because someone had wanted empty apartments. "What about Eleanor's debts?" Another pause. "Richard, how much?" "More than you think." He ended the call. For a long moment he stood still. Then he poured coffee he no longer wanted and left it untouched. Upstairs, Annie had not moved from the doorway. The room still felt borrowed. She placed the clothing bag carefully beside the bed and slowly opened it. Inside were folded sweaters, 2 pairs of jeans, Martha's Bible wrapped in cloth, a framed family picture, medicine papers, and the small knitted scarf her grandmother wore every winter. Annie picked it up. The scarf still smelled faintly of lavender. She sat on the edge of the bed. Her body wanted sleep. Her mind would not allow it. The room was warm. Too warm. Her grandmother was in a hospital bed. Mrs. Helen was probably asleep across the hall from an empty apartment. And somewhere downstairs was a man who had opened his door when he had every reason not to. A knock came. Annie looked up. "Yeah?" The door opened slightly. Richard stood there holding a tray. Annie immediately stood. "I'm sorry, I thought you were asleep. You keep apologizing and I'm going to start charging for it." She almost smiled. He placed the tray on the dresser. "Water, crackers, a banana, 2 aspirin, in case your head starts hurting. You didn't have to do this." "I know." He looked around the room once, then toward the clothing bag lying open beside the bed. The Bible sat on top. He noticed the hospital forms. And the photograph. A younger Martha stood in front of a small church wearing a hat with blue flowers. Beside her was a little girl missing her front teeth. Annie quietly closed the bag. Richard looked away first. "You should sleep." She nodded. He reached the door again. "Mr. Richard?" He stopped. "My grandma always says people remember protection longer than money." Richard turned slightly. "She says when people are scared, they don't remember what you bought them. They remember who stayed." The room went quiet. Richard gave a small nod and left. Annie sat back down. Downstairs, Richard returned to the kitchen. His phone lit again. This time he answered. Eleanor spoke first. "Why aren't you picking up?" "Where are you?" "At the club. At 1 in the morning." "Don't start." Richard looked out the window. "You sold Riverside Court." Silence. Then, "Who told you?" His expression hardened. Upstairs, Annie finally lay down. Downstairs, Richard realized the girl sleeping under his roof had not walked into his life by accident. She had walked out of a decision someone in his own family had made. Richard stood by the kitchen window with the phone pressed against his ear. "You sold Riverside Court." Silence answered first. Then Eleanor spoke. "Who told you?" "That isn't the question. You don't understand the situation." "Then explain it." He heard music in the background, glasses, laughter, the club. "I had debts," she said at last. Richard closed his eyes. "How much?" "Enough." "That's not a number." "Richard." "How much?" Another pause. 300,000. He looked out toward the stable. "You gambled away $300,000? I was going to fix it." "So you sold housing?" "It wasn't just housing. It was people." Eleanor's voice sharpened. "Don't do this. Those apartments were falling apart anyway. Families lived there. Families who barely paid rent." Richard turned from the window. "A girl walked to my property tonight carrying her life in 2 bags because someone emptied that building." The line went quiet. "What girl?" He said nothing. "Richard." He ended the call. The house felt different after that, not because of Annie upstairs, because suddenly the walls seemed connected to something ugly he had not seen. He went to his office instead of bed. The room smelled faintly of leather and old paper. Files covered one side of the desk. Framed awards sat on shelves he rarely looked at anymore. He opened his laptop. Riverside Court. Purchase records. Transfer dates. Holding companies. The deeper he looked, the worse it became. The sale had happened 6 weeks earlier. Temporary management changes. Fast-track notices. Accelerated removals. 3 buildings already partially emptied. Richard leaned back in his chair. Someone had been doing this while he signed checks and attended meetings. At 2:13 in the morning, he closed the laptop. He passed the guest room on the way to his own. The door was not fully shut. Inside, Annie had fallen asleep sitting against the headboard. The blanket had slipped from one shoulder. The clothing bag still rested beside her hand. Richard stood there a moment. The girl had reached safety and still slept like someone prepared to run. He quietly pushed the door closed another inch and walked away. Morning came pale and cold. Annie woke before sunrise. For a few seconds she did not know where she was. Then she saw the quilt folded at the foot of the bed and sat upright. The house, Mr. Richard, the stable, everything returned at once. She looked at the clock. Ludanling Boffin. Grandma. She got out of bed immediately. The room was warm, but she folded the blanket anyway. Straightened the pillow. Smoothed the sheets. Old habits. She carried the clothing bag downstairs. The kitchen lights were already on. Richard stood at the counter wearing jeans and a dark sweater, reading something on his tablet while coffee brewed nearby. He looked up. You sleep at all? A little. You move quietly. I didn't want to wake anybody. You didn't. Annie stopped near the doorway. I should go. Sit. I need to get to the hospital. You'll get there. I mean now. Richard poured coffee into a mug. You eaten? No. That answer keeps happening. I'm okay. He pointed at the chair across from the island. Sit. Annie obeyed. A plate already waited there. Eggs, toast, bacon, fruit. She stared at it. Richard sat opposite her. You eat like you did last night? Her face warmed. I was hungry. I noticed. Annie picked up the fork slowly. The food tasted real in a way hospital vending machines never did. Halfway through the meal, she slowed. Mr. Richard? Why are you helping me? The question stayed between them. Richard set down his mug. I'm still deciding if I am. She looked confused. You needed a place last night. That part was simple. He paused. The rest isn't. Annie lowered her fork. Did I do something wrong? No. Then what? He looked toward the window. Riverside Court belongs to my company. Her hand stopped. No. It did. And you started. I found out last night it was sold. The room went still. The people pushing tenants out? Richard said quietly. They're using my name. Annie looked down at her plate. My grandma used to say rich people never know what happens below them. Richard almost asked what else her grandmother said. Instead, he asked, You trust me enough to go to the hospital together? Annie looked up. Together? I need to verify your grandmother's situation anyway. Something crossed her face. Not offense. Embarrassment. You still think I lied? Richard did not answer immediately. I think people lie when they're desperate, he said finally. And I think people also tell the truth and nobody believes them. Annie looked at the table. That second one happens more. The front gate alarm sounded outside. Richard frowned. His phone vibrated. Daniel, he answered. Yeah? You need to get outside, his attorney said. Now. Why? News vans just pulled up at your gate. Richard stood. What? One of the tenants from Riverside Court posted eviction videos online last night. Reporters found the ownership trail. Richard walked to the window. 2 news vehicles stood beyond the entrance. Cameras already out. He looked upstairs instinctively, then toward Annie. The girl who slept under his roof last night had become part of a story the city was about to learn, and neither of them was ready for it. Richard stood by the window watching the news vans beyond the gate. 2 reporters, 1 camera crew. The guard at the entrance already looked uncomfortable. His phone was still against his ear. How bad? He asked Daniel. Bad enough that social media picked it up overnight. Richard glanced toward Annie. She sat motionless at the kitchen island, fork still in hand. What video? Daniel answered. Tenant eviction clips, elderly residents. 1 woman crying outside Building B. Somebody posted a manager forcing people out after dark. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Who posted it? Don't know yet. I'm heading to Street Luke's. Richard, reporters know the property traces back to Whitmore Housing. It traces back to my wife. Public won't care about that difference. The call ended. Annie still had not touched her breakfast. "You can finish eating," Richard said. She shook her head. "No, Annie, they're talking about my building. Our building," he corrected before thinking. She looked up. Richard rubbed his forehead. "Forget that." "No," Annie said quietly. "You're right." He looked at her. "My grandma always said people who own things don't see them the same way people who live in them do." "What does that mean?" "It means to us it was home." She looked down. To somebody else, maybe it was numbers. The words landed harder than she knew. Richard walked toward the mudroom. "Get your coat." She blinked. "Now? We're going to the hospital." "What about them?" She glanced toward the gate. "They can wait." Outside, the cold hit immediately. Annie carried her clothing bag again. Richard noticed. "You still carrying that everywhere?" She nodded. He opened the passenger door of his truck. "You can leave it here when we get back." Annie touched the handle of the bag. "Maybe later." Richard let it go. The drive to Street Luke Medical Center was quiet at first. Atlanta had already begun waking. Traffic thickened near the intersections. People hurried into coffee shops carrying briefcases and winter coats. Annie looked out the window. "You okay?" Richard asked. She nodded. "You keep doing that." "What?" "Saying yes when you mean maybe." She looked down. "I'm worried." "That sounds more honest." "Grandma doesn't know yet." "About the apartment?" Annie nodded. "I didn't tell her." "Why?" "She needs to get better." Annie stared through the glass. "If she finds out we lost the place, she'll blame herself." Richard drove another block before speaking. "My mother used to do that." Annie turned. "She apologized for getting sick," he said. Like being human was inconvenient. "What happened?" "Cancer." The truck went quiet again. "I'm sorry," Annie said softly. Richard almost made a comment about her apologizing again. This time he didn't. Street Luke came into view 20 minutes later. The lobby smelled like coffee and disinfectant. Annie walked faster the moment they entered. Room 214. She stopped outside the door. Richard stayed back. Inside, Martha sat upright in bed wearing reading glasses, flipping slowly through a devotional book. Her face brightened immediately. "There's my girl." Annie smiled for the first time that morning. "Morning, Grandma." "You slept?" Annie hesitated only half a second. "Yes, ma'am." Martha looked past her. Richard stood in the doorway. The older woman frowned. "Who is that?" Annie turned. "This is Mr. Richard." Martha immediately tried to sit straighter. Richard stepped forward. "Please don't. You brought company and didn't warn me." Martha smoothed the blanket. "I would have fixed my hair." Richard smiled despite himself. "It looks fine." "No, it doesn't. At my age, people start treating you like furniture if you let yourself go." Annie laughed quietly. Martha looked between them. "You fed her?" Richard looked at Annie. Annie looked at the floor. Martha nodded slowly. "That means no." "I ate," Annie said. "When?" "Earlier." "What earlier?" Richard answered before Annie could. "About 20 minutes ago." Martha looked relieved. "Good." A nurse entered carrying a chart. She stopped when she saw Richard. Recognition flashed immediately. "Mr. Whitmore?" Richard gave a small nod. The nurse smiled politely and left. Martha watched the exchange. "You're somebody important?" Richard sat in the chair beside the bed. "Depends who you ask. People with expensive watches always answer like that." Annie covered a smile. Martha reached for her hand. "You went home after visiting hours?" Annie's fingers tightened. Richard noticed. "No, ma'am," Annie said quietly. Martha looked up. The room became still. Annie swallowed. "Grandma." Before she could continue, a doctor entered holding a tablet. "Mrs. Williams, good morning." Everyone stood slightly aside. The doctor reviewed the chart. "We're seeing improvement, but I do need to discuss billing." Annie's shoulders dropped instantly. The doctor continued gently. "Insurance has only covered part of the stay. We'll need arrangements soon." Martha looked down. Annie stepped forward immediately. "I'm working on it." "How soon?" Richard asked. The doctor looked at him. "Within the week." Silence. Annie already knew she did not have it. Richard saw it on her face before she spoke. The doctor left. No one moved. Martha folded her hands together. "I told them I could go home sooner." "Grandma, it costs money to breathe in this place." Annie sat beside her. "We'll figure it out." Richard looked at the hospital room. The old Bible. The knitted scarf folded near the pillow. The flowers someone from church had brought. Then he looked at Annie. The girl who had slept in his stable. the girl carrying her home in a clothing bag. Outside the room, his phone rang again. Daniel. Richard stepped into the hallway. "You need to come back," Daniel said immediately. "What now?" "The press found Eleanor." Richard's expression changed. "And?" "She denied everything." He went still. "What did she say?" Daniel exhaled. "She said the tenants were behind on rent and responsible for their own situation." Richard looked through the glass window at Annie sitting beside her grandmother. His voice dropped. "She said that?" "Yes." Richard ended the call. When he turned back toward the room, Annie was standing in the doorway. She had heard enough from his face. "What happened?" she asked quietly. Richard looked at her. Then, for the first time since finding her in the stable, anger entered his voice. "Someone just decided your grandmother being sick is your fault." Annie stood in the doorway of room 214, her hand still on the frame. "Someone just decided your grandmother being sick is your fault." Richard's words stayed between them. Inside the room, Martha looked up from the bed. "What happened?" Annie turned immediately. "Nothing, Grandma." Martha narrowed her eyes. "That answer never means nothing." Richard looked away first. Annie stepped back inside and sat beside the bed. "The doctor was talking about bills. That's all." Martha sighed and folded her hands over the blanket. "Money again?" "No." "Yes." Martha looked at her granddaughter. "It's always money when poor people get scared." The room went quiet. Richard remained near the window. Martha turned toward him. "Mr. Richard?" "Just Richard is fine." "No, you earned the mister. Sit down." He sat. The older woman studied him for a moment the way older people sometimes did, as if years had taught them to read character before conversation. "You stayed?" she asked. Richard looked confused. "Last night," Martha said. "You stayed and helped her?" "Yes. Most people wouldn't." Richard did not answer. Martha smiled faintly. "That means you know I'm right." Annie lowered her eyes. "Grandma." "No. Let me talk." Martha adjusted the blanket. "Children remember protection longer than money." Richard looked at her. "You can buy people coats," Martha continued, "but they remember who stood outside in the cold with them." The room settled into silence again. A volunteer from the church arrived a few minutes later carrying flowers and a paper bag. "Martha," the woman said brightly. "Dorothy." Dorothy stopped when she saw Annie. "Oh, honey." Her face changed immediately. "Mrs. Helen called this morning." Annie froze. Martha looked up. "Called about what?" Dorothy glanced between them. Richard saw it happen. The hesitation. "Too late." "About the apartment," Dorothy said softly. Annie closed her eyes. Martha slowly lowered the devotional book in her lap. "What apartment?" "Grandma." "Annie." Her voice was calm now. Too calm. Annie sat down beside the bed. "They made me leave." The room went still. "When?" "Last night." Martha stared at her. "You came here from home?" Annie shook her head. "Then where did you sleep?" Silence. Martha looked at Richard, then back at Annie. "You tell me right now." Annie's fingers twisted together. "I walked toward the hospital but got tired." "Annie." "I ended up at Mr. Richard's property." Martha went quiet. "He found me in the stable." Dorothy put a hand over her mouth. Martha closed her eyes. "Not anger." "Fine." "You slept in a barn?" "Grandma, you slept in a barn while I was in here?" Annie's eyes filled. "I didn't want you worrying." Martha turned her face away. For several seconds nobody spoke. Richard stood. "Mrs. Williams." "No." He stopped. The older woman wiped her eyes. "This isn't your fault." She looked at him now. "You helped her." Her eyes moved to Annie. "This is mine." "No," Annie said immediately. "Yes." Martha's voice shook. "I got sick." "You lost the apartment." "You slept in a stable." Annie reached for her hand. "You raised me," she whispered. "Nothing about that is your fault." Martha looked at her granddaughter for a long time. Then she pulled Annie closer. Richard turned away toward the window. Outside, hospital visitors crossed the parking lot carrying coffee and flowers, moving through ordinary mornings while this room held something else entirely. His phone vibrated again. Daniel. He ignored it. A nurse entered carrying paperwork. "Mrs. Williams, billing needs a signature." The older woman reached for her glasses. Richard stepped forward first. "I'll handle it." Everyone looked at him. The nurse blinked. "Excuse me?" "The bill," Richard said. "Put it under my office for now." Annie stood immediately. "No." Richard turned. "No?" he repeated. "You already helped enough." The nurse quietly stepped back out. Annie looked at him. You gave me a place to sleep, food. You brought me here. I can't let you do this too. Why? Because people don't do things like this for free. Martha looked down. Richard stood very still. Then he asked quietly, who taught you that? Annie opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Because she didn't know. Maybe life. Maybe bills. Maybe every closed door. Martha reached for Richard's hand unexpectedly. He looked surprised. Don't be angry at her, the older woman said. People who grow up scared count every kindness because they expect a price later. Richard looked at Annie. She was staring at the floor. He remembered the clothing bag, the stable floor, the way she apologized before asking questions. I'm not paying because you owe me, he said. Annie looked up. I'm paying because no family should choose between staying alive and staying housed. The room went quiet again. A knock came. The nurse returned, looking uneasy. Mr. Whitmore? Yes? There are reporters downstairs. Annie's face changed immediately. The nurse continued. Someone told them you're here. Richard's jaw tightened. Who? We don't know. Martha looked between them. What reporters? Before anyone answered, voices rose from the hallway. Camera shutters. Footsteps. Someone saying Richard Whitmore's name. Annie instinctively stepped closer to the bed. Richard moved toward the door, then stopped. He turned back. Stay here, he said. Annie looked at him. The tone had changed. No hesitation. No distance. Protection. Richard opened the door. A reporter was already walking down the corridor. Mr. Whitmore, she called. Is it true displaced tenants are being hidden on your property? The hallway went silent. Inside room 214, Annie stopped breathing. Mr. Whitmore, the reporter called again. Is it true displaced tenants are being hidden on your property? The hallway seemed to stop moving. Nurses slowed. Visitors turned. Camera shutters clicked. Richard stepped out of room 214 and pulled the door almost closed behind him. Not here, he said. The reporter moved closer anyway. She looked younger than he expected, coat still open from rushing in. Sir, residents from Riverside Court say elderly tenants were removed overnight. One woman claims she slept in her car. Another says her oxygen equipment was left inside. Richard's expression hardened. Who told you I was here? We received a tip. From who? No comment. The cameraman shifted to get a better angle. Behind the door, Annie stood frozen. Martha reached for her hand. Sit down, baby. Annie didn't move. Outside, the reporter continued. Did a tenant stay at your property last night? Richard looked at her. No comment. Is that because it's true? The hallway filled with silence again. Then another voice entered. Move. Everyone turned. An older nurse stepped forward carrying a chart against her chest. This is a hospital, not a press conference, she said. You people want statements. Take it outside. The reporter hesitated. The nurse pointed toward the elevator. Now, for a moment, nobody moved. Then security appeared at the end of the hall. The cameras lowered. Richard stepped aside as the group backed away. The reporter looked at him one last time. We'll keep asking, she said. I expect you will. They left. The corridor slowly returned to normal. Richard stayed outside another minute before re-entering room 214. Annie was still standing beside the bed. You okay? He asked. She nodded automatically. No, Martha said. She isn't. Annie looked down. Martha patted the edge of the bed. Sit. She obeyed. The older woman held her hand. You hear me now? Martha asked quietly. This is why I didn't want you carrying everything alone. Annie's eyes stayed on the floor. Richard's phone vibrated again. Eleanor. He ignored it. Again. Eleanor. This time he answered and stepped into the hall. What? Her voice came sharp. Why are reporters calling me? Because you sold housing to cover gambling debts. You told people? You did that yourself. Richard. No, you don't get to do this. He lowered his voice. Families were put out. They were behind on rent. One of them slept in my stable. Silence. Then, you brought someone home? Richard's face changed. That's your concern? You don't know these people. He looked through the small window in the door. Inside, Annie sat beside her grandmother holding the old woman's hand. No, he said quietly. I think maybe I didn't know them before. He ended the call. When he returned inside, Martha was watching him. You married? She asked suddenly. Richard blinked. Yes. She good to you? Annie looked horrified. Grandma. What? I'm old, not dead. Richard almost smiled. Martha waited. Richard sat back down. It's complicated. That means no, Martha said. Annie covered her face. A knock came. The doctor entered carrying another chart. Mrs. Williams, good news. Your numbers improved overnight. Martha looked relieved. But, the doctor continued, we still need observation another few days. Annie nodded. The doctor glanced at Richard. Administration said billing has been arranged. Annie turned immediately. Richard did not look at her. The doctor smiled. That should reduce stress. After he left, Annie stood. You did it anyway. Richard shrugged. I told you I would. You shouldn't have. And yet here we are. She looked frustrated now. Why won't you let me say no? Richard leaned back in the chair. Because your grandmother needs care more than you need pride. The words hit harder than he meant. Annie went quiet. Martha squeezed her hand. He's right. Annie looked at her. You got your stubbornness from me, Martha said. Unfortunately, Richard's phone buzzed again. Daniel, he answered. Yeah? You need to see this, Daniel said immediately. What now? Another video just went up. Richard walked toward the window. Of what? Your property manager. Richard stopped moving. Calloway? Yes. Daniel's voice dropped. He's on camera telling tenants they're being removed because the new owners want a better class of residents. Richard went still. Inside the room, Annie looked up. He turned slowly. Daniel kept talking. The comments are exploding. People think Whitmore Housing approved it. Richard ended the call. Annie already knew. What happened? Richard looked at her. Then at Martha. The old woman watched him quietly. Finally, he spoke. The man who put you out just made this bigger. Martha frowned. How big? Richard looked toward the hallway where cameras had stood minutes earlier. Big enough that people are going to start asking who was worth keeping. The room fell silent. Annie slowly lowered her eyes, because she already knew what answer people like Mr. Calloway had given. The room stayed quiet after Richard spoke. Annie sat beside the bed with both hands wrapped around Martha's. Outside the window, the winter light had climbed higher, turning the hospital parking lot silver. Martha looked at Richard. What happens now? He did not answer immediately. Now I find out who signed what. Annie looked up. You didn't know? No. You own the company. I own a lot of things. His jaw tightened. That doesn't mean I see everything. Martha nodded slowly. That's how people get lonely, she said. Richard frowned. Too much above them. Nothing around them. Before he could answer, his phone rang again. Daniel. Richard stepped into the hallway. You found Calloway? Yes. Where? At Riverside Court. Richard stopped walking. He's there now? Tenants gathered outside Building B news crews too. Richard looked through the glass at Annie. Keep him there. He ended the call. When he re-entered, Annie stood immediately. What happened? Calloway's at Riverside. Her face changed. My things. Richard looked at her. The rest of my stuff is with Mrs. Helen. Annie grabbed the clothing bag from the chair. I need to go. You're not walking into a crowd. Mrs. Helen's there. Annie. She helped me. If reporters are there. Martha reached for her wrist. Go get our pictures, she said softly. Annie looked down. Our home may be gone. Martha continued. But your grandpa's picture stays with us. Richard picked up his coat. Fine. Annie looked up. We go together. The drive to Riverside Court felt shorter this time. 3 news vans lined the street. Neighbors stood in small groups outside the buildings. Someone held a handmade sign. Let our elders stay. Another read, Housing isn't a game. Annie stared through the window. Mrs. Helen stood near Building C wearing her church coat despite the cold. Richard parked. The moment he stepped out, cameras moved. Mr. Whitmore, did you authorize evictions? Are residents being targeted? Who approved redevelopment? Richard ignored them. Annie stayed beside the truck. Then she saw Mrs. Helen. Mrs. Helen, the older woman turned. Bobby. They met halfway. Mrs. Helen hugged her so tightly the clothing bag slipped from Annie's hand. Oh, thank God, she whispered. I didn't know where you were. I'm okay. Mrs. Helen looked toward Richard. Her expression changed. That the man? Annie nodded. Mrs. Helen walked straight toward him. Richard prepared himself. Instead, she took his hand. Thank you. He looked surprised. She slept somewhere warm because of you. Richard nodded once. Behind them, voices rose near Building B. Calloway stood by the office entrance arguing with 2 residents. You people had notices, one man shouted back. My mother's 80. Richard walked forward. Calloway turned. The color left his face. Mr. Whitmore? The crowd quieted. Richard stopped in front of him. You told residents they were being removed because ownership wanted a better class of tenants. Calloway swallowed. That's not what I meant. Then explain it. The cameras moved closer. Calloway looked around. Sir, maybe not here. No, here. The crowd watched. Annie stood beside Mrs. Helen clutching the clothing bag. Calloway lowered his voice. I was following instructions. Richard went still. Whose? Calloway hesitated. Richard took one step closer. Whose instructions? The man looked down. Mrs. Whitmore's office. The crowd murmured. Reporters immediately started talking into microphones. Richard said nothing. Annie looked at him. His face had gone completely still. A woman near Building A spoke up. My husband served in Vietnam, she said. They gave us 3 days. Another voice joined. My mother's on oxygen. An older black man lifted a box from beside the stairs. They put my wife's sewing machine on the sidewalk. More voices followed. Stories, boxes, medicina, rent receipts. Mrs. Helen wiped her eyes. Richard looked around. This was not one girl anymore. Not one apartment. This was a neighborhood. Annie moved toward Building C. I'll get Grandma's things. Richard turned. I'm coming. Inside the apartment hallway, the air smelled the same. Old paint, laundry soap, someone cooking onions downstairs. Apartment C14 stood locked. Annie touched the door. Her hand stayed there longer than necessary. Richard watched quietly. Mrs. Helen appeared holding a cardboard box. I kept everything I could. Annie opened it. Photo albums. The quilt. Martha's reading glasses. The blue yarn basket. Her eyes filled. Thank you. Mrs. Helen touched her shoulder. You would have done the same. Richard looked around the apartment one last time. Small rooms. Worn furniture. Lives folded into corners. He understood suddenly what Martha meant. People above them. Nothing around them. His phone rang. Eleanor. He answered this time. What? Her voice came fast. Why are you at Riverside? Because you emptied it. Richard, come home. No. Listen to me. You told them they were disposable. I never said that. He looked through the window. Annie stood in the courtyard holding the family photo against her chest. You didn't have to. He ended the call. When he stepped back outside, Annie was waiting beside the truck. The quilt sat in her arms now. Richard looked at it. Your grandmother made that? She nodded. Out of old church dresses. He opened the truck door for her. Behind them, the reporters still circled. Ahead of them, the city was beginning to ask questions. And for the first time, Richard realized he wanted answers too. The drive back to Street Luke was quieter than before. The quilt rested across Annie's lap. Martha's Bible sat beside it along with the framed photograph and the knitting basket Mrs. Helen had saved. Annie kept one hand over the box as if the truck hitting a bump might somehow take everything again. Richard drove with both hands on the wheel. At a red light, he finally spoke. Calloway said he was following Eleanor's office. Annie looked out the window. Maybe he was. You believe him? I believe people with power usually find somebody else to speak for them. Richard glanced at her. My grandma says bad decisions travel downhill. The light turned green. When they reached the hospital, room 214 was empty. Annie stopped in the doorway. The bed was made. The devotional book gone. Her face drained. Grandma? A nurse turned from the station. Mrs. Williams is downstairs for imaging, she said. Annie exhaled so fast she almost laughed. Sorry, the nurse added. She should be back soon. Richard set the box on the chair. Annie carefully took out the framed photograph and placed it beside the bed. Then the quilt. She spread it over the blanket slowly. The room changed immediately. Less hospital, more home. Richard watched from near the window. You carried all that back for her. Annie smoothed one corner of the quilt. Grandma says people heal better when familiar things can find them. The nurse returned with paperwork. Mr. Whitmore? He looked up. There's someone asking for you downstairs. Who? She said she's your wife. Annie's hand stopped on the quilt. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Of course she is. 10 minutes later, he stood in the visitor lounge. Eleanor waited beside the vending machines wearing sunglasses despite being indoors. Expensive coat, perfect hair, her phone still in hand. You look terrible, she said. You came here to comment on my sleep? You embarrassed me. Richard laughed once. Interesting choice of concern. You brought a tenant home. I helped a person. She slept in your stable. She slept in the cold because your office emptied her building. Eleanor crossed her arms. You don't know the whole story. Then tell it. I owed people. Richard stared. Not casinos? She looked away. The answer was enough. How much now? More. His jaw tightened. You sold homes for this. I sold property. No, he said quietly. You sold people's time. Their memories. Their last safe place. Eleanor looked toward the hallway. Who is this girl to you? Richard did not answer immediately. Then he said, nobody. The word felt wrong the moment it left. She's one tenant. Eleanor nodded quickly. Exactly. She's one tenant who walked to my property carrying her life in bags because somebody decided poor people could survive outside. Eleanor lowered her voice. You're getting emotional. No, I'm getting informed. Behind him a voice spoke. Mr. Richard? Both turned. Annie stood near the entrance. She had not meant to interrupt. Eleanor looked at her. The pause lasted a second too long. You're Annie, Eleanor said. Annie nodded. I heard about you. Richard's expression hardened immediately. What does that mean? Nothing. But Annie had already seen it. The measuring look. The same look people gave at front desks, apartment offices, waiting rooms. Eleanor smiled politely. I'm sorry for what happened. Annie answered quietly. Thank you. Eleanor left soon after. The moment she disappeared around the corner, Annie turned. I should go back upstairs. Annie. She stopped. What? Don't do that. Do what? Leave because somebody made you uncomfortable. She looked down. I'm used to it. Richard stood still. Those 4 words bothered him more than the argument with Eleanor. Back in room 214, Martha had returned. The older woman immediately saw the quilt. Her eyes filled. You brought it. Annie smiled. Mrs. Helen saved everything. Martha touched the fabric. This piece was your mama's dress. Her fingers moved to another square. This one was Church Easter Sunday, 1998. Richard sat quietly in the corner while Martha named memories stitched into cloth. At some point, Annie handed him a framed photo. It showed Martha younger beside a man in overalls standing in front of a truck. My grandpa, Annie said. He looks proud. He was. Martha smiled from the bed. He used to tell Annie one thing every Sunday. Richard looked up. What? Martha's eyes moved to Annie. Never let people decide your value while you're surviving. The room grew quiet. A knock came. Daniel stood at the door. He looked tired. Sorry, he said to the room. Need a minute. Richard stepped outside. Daniel handed him a folder. What is it? Tenant record. Richard opened it. Eviction notices. Medical flags. Senior residents. Disabled tenants. Marked. Highlighted. His face changed. What is this? Daniel lowered his voice. The office categorized people. Richard looked up. How? Daniel hesitated. Easier removals. The hallway disappeared for a second. Inside room 214, Annie laughed softly at something Martha said. Richard looked through the glass, then back at the folder. One page carried a handwritten note. Unit C14. Low income. Elderly occupant hospitalized. Fast process. Richard closed the file. His voice dropped. That's her apartment. Richard stared at the file in his hands. Unit C14. Low income. Elderly occupant. Hospitalized. Fast process. The hallway noise faded around him. Daniel lowered his voice. There are more. Richard turned the page. Building B veteran resident. Building A disabled tenant. Red marks. Notes. Priority removals. His jaw tightened. Who made this? We're still checking. No. Richard closed the file. Somebody typed these words. Somebody approved them. Inside room 214, Annie laughed softly at something Martha said. The sound carried through the partly open door and hit him harder than the folder. Daniel looked toward the room. What do you want to do? Richard handed the file back. Freeze every eviction. Daniel blinked. Today. Legally that may. I didn't ask if it was easy. Daniel nodded. I'll start. Richard went back inside. Martha looked up immediately. You have that face. What face? The one men get before they do something expensive. Annie smiled faintly. Richard sat down. How long did you live at Riverside? 26 years, Martha answered. He looked at Annie. You? My whole life. Martha touched the quilt. Her first steps were in that apartment. First day of school. First Christmas tree. After her parents passed. Annie lowered her eyes. Richard stayed quiet. A volunteer from church entered carrying a casserole dish wrapped in foil. Martha, I brought chicken pot pie. She stopped when she saw Richard. Oh, you're still here. Martha nodded. He keeps showing up. The woman smiled. Good. She set the dish down and turned to Annie. Baby, people are asking about you. Annie frowned. Me? At church. Riverside folks too. Richard looked up. The woman hesitated. Mrs. Helen told people someone helped you. Annie looked toward him immediately. I didn't tell anybody, she said quietly. I know. The volunteer continued. Some folks want to thank him. Richard shook his head. Not necessary. Martha looked at him over her glasses. That means absolutely necessary. A nurse entered then. Mrs. Williams, physical therapy wants to walk you this afternoon. Martha sighed. I hate physical therapy. You hate everything that helps you, Annie said. Correct. The nurse smiled and left. Richard's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered. Richard Whitmore. The voice came angry. You stopping evictions? Who is this? Investor group on Riverside redevelopment. Richard stood. We had agreements. You had assumptions. The man lowered his voice. You pull this deal, you lose money. Richard looked at Annie arranging Martha's flowers. How much? Millions. He ended the call. Martha watched him. Bad news? No. He surprised himself with the answer. Actually, he said, I think it's the first good news I've had. Annie looked over. Richard sat back down. I'm stopping the removals. The room went still. Anya started. Martha slowly lowered her hands. You can do that? I can try. Annie's voice came softer. Why? Richard looked at her. Because your file was marked fast process. Because somebody decided sickness made you easier to remove. Because I found you sleeping behind hay. He said none of it. Instead, he answered, because it was wrong. Annie looked down quickly. The room quieted. A few minutes later, Martha dozed off. Annie carefully adjusted the quilt over her shoulders. Richard stood near the window. Mr. Richard? He turned. Thank you. You already said that. I know. Then stop carrying it like debt. She looked confused. The thank you. Annie held the edge of the blanket. I don't know how. Richard leaned against the wall. Learn. Her eyes lifted. No one should spend their whole life apologizing for surviving. The words stayed between them. A knock came. Mrs. Helen appeared in the doorway holding a paper bag. Sorry to interrupt. Annie stood immediately. Mrs. Helen? The older woman smiled. Brought cornbread. Hospital food tastes like regret. Martha opened one eye. You right. Everyone laughed quietly. Mrs. Helen looked at Richard. I heard what you did. News travels fast. In communities like ours, kindness travels faster. She handed Annie the bag, then reached into her purse. There's one more thing. She pulled out a ring of keys. Annie frowned. Your apartment keys? Mrs. Helen nodded. I found them under my couch cushion. Annie stared at them. Metal keys. Small thing. Heavy meaning. Home that no longer existed. Her fingers closed around them slowly. Richard watched her expression change. The grief arrived silently. No tears. Just absence. Martha saw it too. Bobby. Annie shook her head. I'm okay. Richard looked away toward the window because everyone who isn't okay says that. His phone buzzed again. Daniel. He answered. It's done, Daniel said. Eviction's frozen. Richard exhaled. Then Daniel added. But there's something else. What? The buyer is threatening legal action. Richard looked at Annie holding the apartment keys. Let them. Daniel paused. You serious? Richard's voice stayed calm. They moved sick people. He ended the call. Across the room, Annie still held the keys. Keys to a door already locked. Richard looked at them and understood something at last. People did not fight only for houses. They fought for the right to return somewhere and still belong. Annie still held the apartment keys after Daniel's call ended. She turned them over once in her hand, and then placed them beside Martha's Bible on the bedside table. Martha watched quietly. Keep them. Annie looked up. Why? Because losing a place and losing your right to remember it are different things. Richard stood by the window listening. Mrs. Helen adjusted her coat. I should head back before church ladies start calling. Martha smiled. Take the cornbread with you. I brought it. Then take half. Mrs. Helen laughed and hugged Annie before leaving. The room settled again. Martha dozed. The television in the corner played softly without anyone watching. Richard checked his phone. 6 missed calls. 3 emails. 2 messages from investors. 1 from Eleanor. He ignored them all. Annie noticed. "You don't answer her anymore?" The question surprised him. "She hasn't been answering me for a long time either." Annie looked toward the sleeping Martha. "My grandpa used to leave the porch light on when Grandma was upset." Richard turned. "Why?" "He said people come home easier when somebody leaves the light on." Richard looked out the hospital window. "I'm not sure my house has lights for that anymore." Before Annie could answer, the door opened. The doctor entered with a case manager beside him. "Mrs. Williams has improved enough that we can discuss discharge planning." Annie straightened immediately. "When?" "Possibly tomorrow." Relief flashed across her face, then disappeared. The doctor noticed. "Problem?" Annie looked down. Richard already knew. "No apartment. No bed. No place." The case manager opened a folder. "We can discuss temporary placement if housing is unstable." Martha opened her eyes at the word housing. "No." Everyone turned. The older woman pushed herself up slowly. "I'm not going to a facility." "Mrs. Williams." "No." She looked at Annie. "I'm not leaving my granddaughter." Annie took her hand. "You won't." The room stayed quiet. The doctor looked between them. Richard stepped forward. "She'll stay with me." Annie turned so fast the chair moved. "What?" Martha blinked. The doctor lowered his folder. Richard looked at him. "Discharge her tomorrow." Annie stood. "No." Richard looked over. "You can't do that." "I just did." "You didn't ask me." "You have somewhere else?" Silence. Annie looked away. "That isn't fair." "No," Richard said quietly. "None of this is." Martha watched them both. The doctor closed the folder slowly. "We'll finalize paperwork tomorrow." They left. The room remained still after the door closed. Annie crossed her arms. "You can't keep fixing everything." Richard sat down. "Watch me." "That isn't funny." "I wasn't joking." Annie looked frustrated now. "You already paid hospital bills." "Correct." "You let me stay." "Yes." "You froze evictions." He nodded. "You don't even know us." Richard leaned back. "I know enough." "No, you don't." The answer came faster than she intended. Martha watched quietly. Annie looked down. "You know, one night," she said softly. "One hallway, one apartment. You don't know what comes after." Richard did not interrupt. "You don't know people looking at us different because we need help. You don't know choosing medicine over groceries. You don't know pretending you ate already because somebody older needs the food." The room went silent. Martha squeezed Annie's hand. Richard looked at her for a long moment. "You're right." Annie blinked. "I don't know those things." He stood. "But I know this. Nobody leaves that hospital tomorrow without somewhere safe." He walked out. The hallway was empty. Daniel waited near the elevators. "You look angry," Daniel said. "I am." "About the lawsuit?" "No." Richard looked back toward room 214. "I'm angry because an 18-year-old thinks safety is something she has to earn." Daniel stayed quiet. Richard handed him the folder from Riverside. "Find a house." Daniel frowned. "What kind?" "Small, quiet. Near church if possible." Daniel started. "Richard." "For them." The elevator opened. Daniel still had not moved. "You serious?" Richard stepped inside. "Very." Back in room 214, Annie sat beside Martha again. The older woman touched her hand. "You hurt his feelings." Annie looked up. "What?" Martha smiled faintly. "Men like that spend their lives being thanked. Nobody tells them they don't understand." "I wasn't trying to be mean." "I know." Annie looked toward the door. "I just don't want to owe him forever." Martha squeezed her fingers. "Baby. Some people help because they want power." She glanced toward the hallway. "Some help because they finally saw something." The door opened again. Richard returned carrying 2 coffees. He handed one to Annie. "I don't drink coffee," she said. "It's hot chocolate." She looked down. Marshmallows floated on top. Martha smiled without saying anything. Richard sat. "Good news." Annie looked up. "The eviction freeze is official." Her shoulders lowered. "And?" He looked at her. "No one from Riverside gets removed tonight." The room went quiet. Outside, afternoon light spread across the hospital windows. Inside room 214, Annie wrapped both hands around the cup. Warm, small, real. For the first time since losing the apartment, she allowed herself one dangerous thought. Maybe tomorrow would still exist. Annie wrapped both hands around the hot chocolate cup. The marshmallows had already begun melting into the surface. No one from Riverside gets removed tonight. The sentence stayed in the room. Martha leaned back against the pillow and smiled quietly. That sounds like somebody finally remembered poor people sleep at night too. Richard sat by the window. His phone remained face down beside him. For the first time all day it stayed silent. A knock came. Daniel stepped in carrying a folder and a paper bag. "You eat yet?" he asked Richard. Richard looked up. "You bringing lunch now?" "You forgot breakfast." Annie looked between them. Daniel noticed and smiled. "He forgets food when he's angry. I'm right here. That has never stopped me before." Martha laughed softly. Daniel set the folder down. "Need 5 minutes." Richard stood. The two men stepped into the hallway. Daniel handed him documents. "The injunction is filed. Evictions frozen temporarily." Richard nodded. "And?" The buyer backed off. "Why?" Daniel almost smiled. "Public pressure. Turns out people don't enjoy hearing seniors got removed while one was hospitalized." Richard looked through the glass toward room 214. Annie sat beside Martha, showing her the framed photo from Riverside. "What about the house?" Daniel handed him another paper. 3 options. Richard scanned the addresses. Small ranch homes. One near church. One near a bus route. One near a community center. "Too big," Richard said. Daniel blinked. "What?" "They don't need space. They need peace." Daniel watched him. "You changed." Richard folded the paper. "No. You brought a stranger home. I helped somebody. You're buying them a house." Richard looked away. That wasn't the plan. Back inside room 214, Martha was telling Annie stories from the quilt again. "This patch came from your mama's Easter dress." Annie smiled. "And this one? Your grandpa's work shirt." He hated throwing anything away. The door opened. Richard returned. Martha looked up immediately. "You finished saving the world?" "Still under construction." Daniel entered behind him. Martha studied him. "You, the lawyer?" Daniel nodded. "You look tired." "That's because I work for him." Richard sat down. Daniel placed the folder on the bed tray. "What's that?" Annie asked. "Housing options." The room went quiet. Annie looked at Richard. "You already found places?" "Looking," he corrected. Martha adjusted her glasses. "Show me." Anya started. "Grandma." "Baby, I'm old, not blind." Martha opened the folder. Small white house. Front porch. Rocking chair. Maple tree. The older woman touched the photo. "Oh." Annie looked over. "It's pretty." Martha nodded. "It looks like somewhere people wave at neighbors." Daniel smiled. "Church is 6 minutes away." "Bus stop?" 3 blocks. "Grocery?" 10. Martha looked satisfied. Annie looked overwhelmed. Richard watched her. "You don't have to decide today." Annie lowered her eyes. "You keep doing things before I can answer." Richard leaned back. "You keep surviving before anyone can help." The room quieted. A nurse entered carrying discharge forms. "Mrs. Williams, tomorrow morning if all goes well." Martha smiled. Annie gripped the edge of the chair. "Tomorrow. Real now." The nurse left. Martha reached for Annie's hand. "You hear that?" Annie nodded. "We're leaving." Her voice shook on the last word. Richard looked out the window. He understood. Leaving the hospital meant facing everything waiting outside. No apartment. No certainty. No old life. His phone vibrated. "Eleanor." Again. He answered this time. "What?" Her voice came softer than before. "We need to talk." "We already did." "Richard." "I'm busy." "You bought them a house?" He went still. "How do you know that?" Silence. Then, "People are talking." Richard looked toward Daniel. The lawyer's face changed. Eleanor continued. "You're making me look cruel." Richard's expression hardened. "You did that yourself." He ended the call. Daniel spoke quietly. "She has someone feeding information." Richard looked at then at Annie. The girl was helping Martha fold the quilt over her legs. Small movements. Careful hands. Like she still expected things to disappear. Mrs. Helen appeared at the doorway again, carrying a church bulletin. "I got news." Everyone looked up. The church collected money. Annie blinked. "What?" Mrs. Helen smiled. "Riverside folks too. Small amounts. $20 here, 10 there. Martha's eyes filled. Mrs. Helen handed Annie an envelope. For your grandmother. Annie opened it. Inside were folded bills, handwritten notes, prayers. One card simply read, "You belong here." Annie looked down quickly. Mrs. Helen touched her shoulder. "Community remembers." The room stayed quiet. Richard watched Annie hold the envelope with both hands, not because of the money, because somebody remembered them. Martha looked at Richard. "See?" He turned. People survive because somebody stays. Richard looked toward the window, then back at Annie. Tomorrow they would leave the hospital. For the first time since finding her in the stable, he realized something. He no longer worried where Annie would sleep. He worried whether she would ever feel safe enough to unpack. Morning came quietly. Sunlight reached room 214 before anyone spoke. Martha was already awake, sitting up with the quilt folded over her lap and her glasses low on her nose. Annie slept in the chair beside the bed, one hand still resting near the envelope from church. Martha smiled. Stubborn child. Richard stood outside the room holding coffee when he heard it. "You talking about me?" he asked as he entered. "No. You got money. She got stubbornness." Annie opened her eyes. "Grandma? You drool when you sleep in chairs." "I do not." Richard handed her hot chocolate. "You do." Annie looked betrayed. Martha laughed. The nurse arrived half an hour later with discharge papers. "Mrs. Williams, you're officially free." Martha took the papers like somebody handing back years. About time. Annie helped her change into church clothes from the clothing bag. Blue cardigan, long skirt, the knitted scarf. When Martha came out of the bathroom, Richard stood. "You look ready for Sunday service." "That's because I dress for dignity even on Tuesdays." They left the hospital just after 10. Cold air greeted them outside. Martha stopped for a moment. Real sky, real wind, no machines. Annie held her arm. Richard opened the truck door. "Careful." Martha looked at him. "You always this bossy?" Apparently. The drive was quiet at first. Martha watched the city pass. "Where are we going?" Richard looked ahead. "Home." Annie turned immediately. "What?" Martha looked between them. Richard said nothing else. The truck left downtown, past the church district, past a small grocery store, then into a neighborhood lined with maple trees and front porches. Annie frowned. "This isn't your place." "No." The truck stopped in front of a small white house. Front porch, rocking chair, blue shutters, a maple tree in the yard. The same house from the folder. Nobody moved. Martha looked out the window. "Oh." Annie turned to Richard. "No." He took the keys from the console. "No?" he repeated. "You bought it." "Yes." "No." "Yes." Martha laughed quietly from the back seat. Annie shook her head. "We can't." "You can." "We can't accept this." Richard got out of the truck. Annie followed immediately. Cold air hit them. "You can't keep doing things before asking." Richard leaned against the truck. "If I asked, you'd say no." "Yes." "Exactly." Annie stared at the house. The porch swing moved slightly in the wind. Flower boxes sat beneath the windows. Somebody had already placed a welcome wreath on the door. "When?" she asked quietly. "Yesterday." "Yesterday?" "I had help." Daniel stepped out from the side yard holding a toolbox. Martha laughed from inside the truck. "I knew it." Mrs. Helen appeared from the porch carrying a casserole dish. "You thought I'd miss moving day?" Annie covered her face. "Everybody knew?" Mrs. Helen nodded. "Church ladies had opinions." Daniel added, "Strong opinions." Martha stepped slowly out of the truck. She stood looking at the house for a long time. Then she touched the porch rail. "Real wood." Mrs. Helen smiled. "Kitchen stocked too." Annie turned. "What?" Mrs. Helen counted on her fingers. "Soup, bread, tea, cornmeal, chicken, apple pie." Martha nodded approvingly. "Civilized people." Richard walked to the porch. He held out the keys. Annie looked at them. Metal again. Different keys. Different door. Her eyes filled. "I don't know what to say." "Then don't." She looked up. Richard placed the keys in her hand. No speeches. No thank you debt. Just open the door. Her fingers closed around them. Slowly she walked to the entrance. The lock turned. Inside waited sunlight. Wood floors. A quilt folded over the sofa. Fresh flowers on the table. 2 framed photographs already stood near the fireplace. The one of her grandfather. The church picture. Annie stopped. Martha touched her shoulder. How? Richard looked away. Mrs. Helen. The older woman smiled proudly. You think I was letting strangers arrange your memories? Martha sat in the rocking chair by the window. She looked around once, then twice. Her eyes filled. This house feels like somebody expected us. Nobody spoke. Richard stood near the doorway. Annie turned toward him. Mr. Richard? He looked up. You said nobody leaves the hospital without somewhere safe. He nodded. She looked around the room. You meant it. Richard looked at the house. The porch. The quilt. The older woman sitting by the window. The girl holding keys she no longer had to hide. Yes, he said quietly. Outside, wind moved through the maple tree. Inside, for the first time since Riverside Court, Annie set down the clothing bag. She did not keep it in her hands. She left it by the door. The house slowly filled over the next week. Not with furniture, with signs of living. Martha's Bible stayed on the side table near the window. The blue yarn basket moved beside the rocking chair. Church ladies brought casseroles every other day whether anyone asked or not. Mrs. Helen claimed the freezer looked emotionally empty and fixed it herself. Annie unpacked slowly. One drawer, one shelf, one photograph at a time. The clothing bag remained by the door until Friday. Richard noticed it immediately when he stopped by after work. He carried groceries in one hand and a small paper bag in the other. Martha looked up from the rocking chair. You keep arriving with food. You keep accepting it. That's because I'm smart. Annie came from the kitchen. Richard set the groceries down, then stopped. The clothing bag was gone. He looked toward the hallway. Annie noticed. I unpacked. He nodded once. Good. Martha smiled to herself. Outside, winter had softened. The maple tree still held a few leaves. Inside, the house sounded different now. Pans in the kitchen, a radio playing low gospel music, footsteps, life. Richard stayed for dinner. Chicken stew, cornbread, sweet tea. Martha insisted. Halfway through the meal, she pointed her spoon at him. You working Annie too hard yet? Richard frowned. Working? Annie looked down. Martha laughed. She didn't tell you? Richard looked at Annie. She comes by the stable every morning. His eyes moved back to Annie. You've been going to the stable? Annie nodded carefully. Only after breakfast. Richard leaned back. Doing what? Helping. With? Everything. Martha smiled. She brushes the horses. Annie looked embarrassed. She talks to Grace too. Richard almost smiled. Grace still likes you? She waits at the gate now. The room quieted. Richard looked at Annie. When were you planning to mention this? I wasn't sure you'd want me there. You already walked into the place once. That was different. Yes, he said quietly. It was. Martha reached for her tea. Girl sleeps in a stable one night and comes back employed. Annie laughed despite herself. Richard reached into the paper bag he brought. I actually came for something. He handed Annie an envelope. She looked confused. Inside was a card. Whitmore Estate. Animal care assistant. Part-time. Flexible schedule. Training included. Annie looked up. What is this? Ayub. She stared. You said you worked around horses. A little. You were good with Grace. That doesn't mean... It means I noticed. Martha sat back smiling. Annie looked down at the paper again. I don't know what to say. Try yes. Her eyes filled. Richard looked away toward the window. Outside, the sunset touched the maple tree gold. His phone vibrated. Daniel, he answered. It's done, Daniel said. What is? Court approved the injunction. Riverside redevelopment is frozen. Richard went quiet. And? The tenant protection stay. He looked toward Annie. She was still holding the job offer. Thank you, Richard said. He ended the call. Martha watched him. Good news? He nodded. No more removals. The room fell silent. Martha closed her eyes briefly. Annie looked toward the family photograph on the shelf. No more removals. No more nights outside. No more carrying home in bags. Martha stood slowly and walked to the window. The maple tree moved in the evening wind. You know, she said softly. That night she lost everything. Annie looked up. Martha turned. I thought life had finally taken too much. The room stayed quiet. Annie looked at Richard, then at the house, the rocking chair, the quilt, the kitchen light, the keys hanging by the door. No, Annie said softly. That was the night life found us again. Nobody spoke after that. Outside, daylight faded. Inside, the house held. 1 year later, the porch carried 2 rocking chairs. Martha's health was better. The maple tree had grown. Grace still waited at the stable gate every morning. Annie worked at Whitmore Estate now. Not because she needed saving, because she belonged there. Riverside Court still stood. The redevelopment never happened. A small plaque near the community garden read, "Home is not a privilege." Richard paid for it anonymously. Mrs. Helen told everyone anyway. Some secrets never survive church ladies. On autumn evenings, Martha still sat by the window with her knitting. Sometimes Annie would pass the old clothing bag folded neatly in the closet. She never threw it away. Not because it still held pain, because it reminded her of the night she carried everything she owned into a stable and walked out with a future. This story reminds us that home is more than walls and rent payments. It is memory, dignity, safety, and the people we love. The story also shows how easily society can overlook the struggles of the poor, the elderly, and those carrying invisible burdens. Annie's journey teaches that asking for help is not weakness, and Richard's transformation proves that real justice begins when people choose to see suffering instead of looking away. In the end, kindness does not only change the life of the person receiving it, it can also change the person giving it. Sometimes one night, one act of compassion, and one open door are enough to change a destiny forever. This video is a work of fiction created with the assistance of artificial intelligence. All characters, events, and situations are not real, and do not represent any actual people or true stories. The content is intended for storytelling and emotional illustration only.